Hello and welcome, myself and Todd from Safe Landing here. And we are having another conversation, having previously had a bit of a chat about the listening circles that we'll be organizing through Safe Landing. Um, in the first session, now some of you may have had a chance to hear that, we had a bit of a chat about why we felt that listening circles were important, but particularly focusing a little bit on our own experience and our own story as former pilots, why we left the sector, what that was like, and yeah, the experience of meeting people, sharing what it was like, particularly what it was like emotionally, and the value of kind of hearing and listening to each other, and therefore why we are offering these listening circles for members of our community for Safe Landing. So again, some of you may have heard that. If you haven't, we would encourage you to have a listen. This kind of follows on from that, and we have a special guest with us. So I'm going to hand over to Todd to explain a bit more.
So yeah, I'm not a special guest. My name is Todd. I'm a member of the community with Dan here in Safe Landing, both former pilots. And yeah, Caroline Hickman has gratefully come to join us today to extend this conversation. And yeah, we're going to be basically just looking at some of the what we see as maybe some of the frequently asked questions, I suppose. Having you probably hearing this, having just done maybe your first listening circle. So yeah, I mean, why don't we just start off and for Caroline to introduce herself and to answer, what is climate anxiety?
Thanks, Todd. And good to be here. Good to join you to have this conversation. So, I'll be bringing in some thoughts about this from a climate psychology perspective. My background is both as a psychotherapist, specializing in climate anxiety, but also as an academic doing research and writing around the subject for quite a while. Um, it's good to start with that question about what is climate anxiety. And people call it different things: climate distress, climate despair, climate horror, climate anxiety. We've completely missed the boat on calling it something sensible or redefining it. Because it's been picked up as a term, and I'm never going to complain about people talking about mental health issues, right? It almost doesn't matter what it is called. What we're talking about is a mixture, an incredible mixture of feelings that we have in response to what we see going on in the world. Anxiety is often one of the first emotions that we feel in relation to this. We look at what's going on in the world around us and we care about the world around us. And we feel anxious or we feel stressed or we feel worried. But it doesn't stop with anxiety. We can often then feel sadness or feel depression or feel grief and a sense of loss that the world that maybe we grew up in or the world that we've inherited from parents or grandparents is not the same. I was having a conversation with somebody this morning, and the conversation was entirely about when do we know when spring starts? We were walking and talking on the phone to each other. And it was like, well, I've got bluebells coming up. And he was saying, yeah, well, we've got these things coming out. We've got primroses coming out. And we figured out we couldn't quite work out whether this was normal, natural, or climate change. So, why am I saying that? I'm saying that to say we all feel quite dysregulated and confused about how things are playing out at the moment. We're living in a time of enormous change and witnessing it as it happens, but it's really hard to measure and understand. So, mixture of feelings. The key thing to say is any emotional response that you're having in response to thinking about climate or ecological change is you're having that because you care. And instead of pathologizing it or saying that it's a form of mental illness or mental health problem, I would say you should be proud that you care, right? So we can't get rid of climate anxiety or climate distress because it's a mentally healthy response to what's going on in the world. But what we can do is frame it positively so that we say, I'm feeling this because I care. And then you say, and now what can I do about it? And absolutely, one of the things we can do about it is be in community, to share, to listen to other people so that you know you're not alone. That's the number one thing we can do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. And just for context, we're recording this on the 23rd of January, and I think the daffodils were up in our front garden mid-December. So yeah, it's a very real question.
That is a
Absolutely.
good point. I mean, it's interesting some of the work we've been doing, and in fact, another area of work that we're talking about and that we'll be offering to Safe Landing community members is climate fresque. And one of the events I attended recently as part of that training described it rather than talking about global warming, talked about global weirding, just because like a lot of people don't really, at a scientific level, actually know that much about what's going on. But at
Mm,
some level, most people are picking up on it. And I think, Caroline, it felt like you were sort of referencing that sense of discomfort. Like, yeah, like
mm.
if you think about the fruit trees last year, like obviously like an incredible harvest, but at some level, a lot of people were just like, what is going on?
Yeah,
What message are the trees trying to send us right now? And like at some level, what are we picking up on? And yeah, like what is the value of consciously recognizing it? Because I one of the things myself and Todd spoke about in the first recording was
mm,
like this idea that it's like an itch that you can't scratch. When I was flying for years, when especially when I was asking for the fuel figures, these vast fuel figures before a long flight, tens of tons of kerosene. There was this discomfort that I hadn't realized, this itch I couldn't scratch. And then I became consciously aware of it. And that was perhaps a bit more painful, but actually allowed me to process it and recognize it and talk about it. I just
mm.
wondered if you could help perhaps people to understand what that's like to go from having this itch you can't scratch. You recognize there's some weird stuff going on. You know it doesn't feel right, but you don't quite know what to do with it.
Yeah,
You realize more. And then
yeah.
what?
I think that's a brilliant way of putting it, Dan. Um, when I do talks on this, I have a slide that I share, which sometimes works, sometimes doesn't work. And it's a goldfish bowl full of goldfish swimming around going, water, what water? And it's really hard for a fish doesn't conceptualize of what water is because it's environment. And it's very similar for us. We don't conceptualize of what's going on because it's our normal. And it's only when you look back, and that was this conversation this morning, to try and remember, did I see bluebells coming up at the end of January this time last year? I can't remember. And of course, it varies. So we've got seasonal change, and then we've got climate change, and then we've got our own powers of observation. What you're pointing to is consciousness, Dan. You're saying about bringing things out of unconscious or semi-conscious awareness into consciousness so that we become more and more and more aware. And the more aware we become, the more uncomfortable we become. Loads of people say to me, I wish I didn't know about climate change. I wish I could go back to before I knew about it, because then I could kind of live my life in my kind of happy innocence or naivety and not worry about it. But once you know about it, then that's the itch, isn't it? But you can't quite scratch it because you're living in an environment that just creates another itch somewhere else. Timothy Morton talks about this as a hyperobject, which is, when you kind of pay attention to one part, another part kind of goes, yeah, but what about me? So you go, oh, okay, all right. So you think, okay, we'll worry about that. And then there's another bit over here, and you think, oh, okay, it's too big to see all at once. It's way too big for us as ordinary mortals to understand fully. Honestly, I do apologize for this next statement, but if anybody ever tells you they're an expert on climate change and climate psychology, don't listen to them, run away. They're lying to you, honestly, because I've been studying this for nearly 20 years and I'm only just starting to understand it. And I think we've got to have the humility and the curiosity to say, we do not quite know what's going on. So when we talk about that kind of how do we navigate this as animal bodies, as mere mortals, with intellect and with consciousness, and take into account the fact that it's human caused. So that brings a real complexity of guilt and grief and shame. And yet we're not ExxonMobil, right? So we're only little mortal humans in this. And we can have defenses like denial or disavowal, where we say, oh, it's not that bad, you know, oh, technology will save us. It's an extraordinary mixture of things that we are trying to navigate our way through at the moment. And I'll shut up in a minute. I can't do short answers. I'm sorry, I do try, but I just can't. Um, One of the things underpinning this that I think is really important is to recognize that humanity collectively has never faced anything on this scale before, ever. I mean, we've got experience of dealing with global disasters, but we have never faced anything on this scale. And what that means is we hardly know how to imagine it or see it or navigate it. We haven't got a blueprint, we haven't got a map. And of course, we've got pieces of the jigsaw, like technology and legal solutions and political solutions and psychological solutions and human ecological care, but they've all got to be used together. And that is where it makes it very, very complicated for humans. And it's inevitable that what we often do to comfort ourselves is kind of resort back to old stories. We've dealt with tsunamis, we've survived world wars, we've coped with the Cuban Missile Crisis. You know, we can cope with this. Just, you know, the trouble is, all of those human disasters that we've, and conflicts and challenges did not affect the whole of the world all at once. It's like that film that came out, Everything Everywhere All at Once. This, when it comes to the climate ecological crisis, it is everything everywhere all at once. And we
Mm.
don't really know how to navigate that. So that's a very, very good starting point to say we need to have those other kinds of solutions, but we also need to be talking about it and recognizing that we haven't got quick and easy answers to this. Because anyone who tells you that we have is lying to you. It's like telling children a bedtime story so they don't think there are monsters under the bed. It might make you feel a little bit better for a little while, but it doesn't really solve things. So we've got to wrestle our egos under control. And a brilliant way of doing that is listening to other people's fears and thoughts and knowledge about that and gaining comfort from it and giving information ourselves, which is why that kind of collective approach, like safe landing and listening circles and climate fresk, is absolutely brilliant. Because, and that's why I have my Friday morning conversations with colleagues. It's like,
Mm.
I want to hear from them. They teach me and I teach them, and we all come out of it sometimes thinking, oh, I wish I didn't know that, but also thinking, oh, I'm glad I've heard that. So it's a real
Yeah.
mix.
So interesting, and it sort of reminds me of some of the early conversations, Todd, that you and I had when we're sort of we've obviously both become maybe moved from the unconsciously aware to consciously aware. So for me, it was the itch I couldn't scratch to now I do know that this is really bothering me. And in addition to all those complexities, Caroline, that you just mentioned around why this is so hard to grasp as a human being, I was then added into that melting pot was this conflict between a
Mm,
job that I loved, I'd
mm,
always wanted to do since I could remember, that I was
mm,
benefiting from financially, that I still had a lot of debt to pay off to,
mm,
before it would sort of um, wash its own face, as it were. And I didn't know what to do with that. And I remember though the first time that I spoke to Todd and actually just expressed that to someone who was in a similar situation and heard them explain it themselves.
yeah.
And I don't know, Todd, whether you can remember much about what that was like and why that's kind of so profound, because I feel like our experience is the what, and Caroline can perhaps help us understand the why.
Yeah, no, Dan, incredibly important and profound. Because up until the point of meeting you and George, I felt completely alone. I tried sharing Guardian articles with colleagues, didn't go down too well. People, I felt I felt like I was alone, and also, given our roles as pilots, we've got an enormous amount of responsibility where people want to be able to trust us, and you know, there's less of a taboo probably nowadays about talking about mental health as pilots, but it's still there. So, if you start to feel this way, and at the same time, you got to put your hat on and play the part. What's the balance there? And what would you say to Caroline? What would you say to someone, Caroline, if they felt that they were like the only one, and perhaps sort of not wanting to speak up and take that first step?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Couple of things. Um, I'll start on a macro level. I think everyone on the planet, this is the way I would argue this today now, is that everyone on the planet has climate anxiety.
Mm,
Every single person. How can you not? Except maybe that little group of sociopaths who don't care about anything. And there are actually very few of them,
mm,
thankfully. But everyone else has some level of climate anxiety. You could have quite mild climate anxiety where you're reassured quite easily and quickly, you know, recycling is great. Of course it is, but you know, um, technology will save us. So it can stay fairly mild. But the more you know, this is the irony of this, the more you know, the worse your anxiety gets. So the more knowledge you have, the more concern you're going to have. So it can become your climate distress can grow. And as it grows, you don't want that to just be a conversation with yourself. You need to share those concerns with other people and check out, am I the only one who thinks this? Am I going mad? You know, you can't just have a conversation with yourself. Macro level, I think everybody's got climate anxiety, but people also have defenses against it. So a lot of people will go, la 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 la, can't cope, don't want to hear that. I just need to, get the kids to school or, clean the house and keep my job and just leave the world away from me. I can only focus, I'm exaggerating to make a point, but but the more you understand it, the more you see, the more you read, the more you see on television, the more you share those concerns with other people, you're going to feel the impact of that. At its worst, the impact can be unbearable. And that's what Dan was talking about, where that balance of that dilemma becomes you're unable to just tolerate that. You've got to act, you've got to do something different. But we can tolerate it for quite a while. One of the key things in that is find things to do which are internal action. So you talk about how you think, talk about how you feel, share that with other people so you're not alone. And also external action, do stuff in the world. Doesn't matter what you do, as long as you find some way to express that concern. Otherwise, you're just going to be pushing it down and at its worst, it intrudes into your dreams. You'll end up dreaming about it, or you'll end up getting angry or scared of other things. It'll push its way through for you. So I think everyone shares that concern. It can just be very, very difficult to raise that into people's consciousness because it makes people feel scared, threatened, uncomfortable. You are not scaring them if you raise it. A lot of the time people say, oh, you mustn't talk to children about this, or, do you want to, you're frightening people. No, you're not. You're not frightening people. You're just bringing into consciousness things they're already aware of, subtly or unconsciously. So definitely do that gently and a little bit at a time, but do that in a way where it can be contained. You don't just want to tell people terrible, terrible news and frighten them and then expect them to feel okay because they won't feel okay. So a container, in psychologically, we talk about the importance of containers. And one of the key containers is a therapy relationship and a group, because you're not on your own. Basic human needs, we are absolutely all the same at some level. We want to be seen, we want to be heard, we want to be understood. One of my favorite definitions of mental illness was Donald Winnicott, who said mental illness consists of not being able to find somebody who can tolerate being with you. So that's the key thing. You only need one person who
Mm.
listens to you and goes, yeah, I get it. No, yeah, I understand. Because then you feel understood and then you're not alone. Feeling alone and isolated from your family, from society, from your community, from your business community, from your profession becomes unbearable for us as humans. It becomes absolutely intolerable. We survive in groups, whether it's family groups or professional groups. We don't like to be isolated.
Mm.
So, bring it back to that micro level of the individual needs to not feel alone. But frankly, everyone on the planet has some level of anxiety, and it's finding ways to communicate that and talk about it in ways that people can relate to. I mean, my poor father, he's no longer alive, but he listened to me talk about this stuff for years, years. Poor man. No, he had to. It was his job as my dad. Years and years and years, and I just kind of got rebuffed. And then And then he watched a David Attenborough documentary. And I went over to help him do some gardening, and I got the hosepipe out to do some watering. And he came rushing out the house going, no, 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 we've got to save water. We've got to conserve our resources. And I've just watched this David Attenborough documentary. And it was like, and I stood there and I thought, yeah, I've been saying that for years, Dad. And I'm so glad David Attenborough got through to you, right? And it's like when people can't hear it from one perspective, they'll hear it from another one, or another one, or another one. And that's why groups are incredible, because people
Mm.
will find different languages. People will relate to somebody in the group. And they might sit there and go, no, I don't feel like that. And then they'll listen to someone else and they'll go, oh, but I do feel like that. So you get all these different mirrors in a group, and you come out of it going, oh, there's somebody there who is like me. And then we feel good. Then we feel relieved.
Yeah, it's fascinating, and it reminds me a little bit of just sort of, I suppose, fairly basic psychology principles around listening and empathy, or the concept that from sort of MRI studies around when we know when we experience a challenging, a difficult emotion, that just verbalizing it, we can see from blood flow in the brain that it can lower that response. But then how that's accentuated when we connected with someone who's hearing it and responding to it, and it just I find the underlying I could talk about it forever, but I'm mindful that there's some things that we would love to ask, perhaps more specifically about the process, and perhaps what might happen after someone attends one of these listening circles.
Mm.
So, given Safe Land's been going for sort of the last 4 years now, we've done a fair amount of work externally. You could say, we're lobbying politicians, we're holding worker assemblies, increasing worker participation, and all this sort of wonderful technical expertise around what the future of flight could be, what technology, how the future of the industry is going to take shape. Why do you think it's important at this stage to have something like a listening circle, and perhaps be doing something less overt?
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because often people, back to Dan's uh, itch that you can't scratch comment earlier, it's like once you become aware of the multiple difficulties being faced by the planet and people and animals, you want to do something. We have that impulse to do, to be practically useful. Um, and listening, I think it's important to understand that it's not just a passive process. that there is something absolutely to be gained from processing internally, listening, empathizing. We've already talked about not feeling alone. We've talked about finding community. So you've got a nice balance there with the internal action and then external action and or external activism. Listening and hearing others is not passive. It's not doing nothing. It's doing something, but it's feels and looks differently. It's about being a human being, not a human doing. And, I'm not taking away the importance of practical action. Practical action is the other side of the coin. Um, but listening circles allow us to reflect, to engage with feelings that perhaps otherwise might be disallowed or uncomfortable, or that we might feel ashamed of. If you're feeling depressed and you often it's the feelings about the feelings that are difficult for us as humans. So we feel anxious and then we get anxious about the fact we've got anxious, or we get sad or depressed and then we judge ourselves and say, oh, I mustn't be depressed about this. I've got to do something. Or depression is bad or stupid or pathetic, or, you know, we're often quite judgmental about our own feelings. We can be much more kind and empathic towards other people's feelings. So, one of the key things about listening circles is about learning to not judge ourselves through not judging other people, and listening to that diversity of emotional responses. Eco anxiety includes anxiety, depression, fear, denial, fantasies of rescue, apocalyptic fantasies. It's a space in which you can say, yes, but what if it's all a catastrophe and it's all hopeless? And express your nihilism and have
Mm.
somebody else say, yeah, I can feel like that sometimes, but I also can feel like this. So you hear that range of emotional responses, and feel grief and sadness, which are collective emotional experiences because we have done this. It's not an individual responsibility. The idea emotionally, so how does this shift things for us emotionally? The idea emotionally in Climate Psychology Alliance and other climate psychology groups talk about developing radical hope, not naive hope. Naive hope is like, oh, it'll be all right. Technology will save us, or the government will save us. Or my particular favorite, oh, aliens will descend to the earth and rescue us. I love these people because, well, how do you know if they won't? But anyway, I digress. You've got a naive hope, which kind of says, rescue me. But a radical hope says, well, things are tough, things are hard. This is part of the reality of the world we live in today. And what can we do about it? So, what you end up with is instead of a splitting psychological either it's terrible or it's fine, you get a both and. It's tough. And we wish this wasn't happening. And what can we do about it? So having that both and approach holds together psychologically that desire to split apart and go to either extreme of it's all a catastrophe or, oh, we'll be fine. Because there are multiple uncertainties in the middle of those two extreme positions.
Mm.
And that we need to be able to explore that and tolerate it. And when we do that, the more we can do that, the more we can build emotional intelligence and emotional resilience. Because we can't get rid of it, we can't magic it away, we can't avoid it. Although people do have fantasies about Iceland or Mars or New Zealand, there is nowhere on the planet that will not be affected, basically.
Mm.
So, what we need is the capacity to tolerate this, to have resilience. And radical hope says, yeah, it's hard and we might be going off a cliff, but we're going to go down fighting. We're going to do everything that we can. That in turn helps us feel that we are fully alive, fully engaged with the complexity of what it means to be alive today. And it's not always going to be comfortable, but it
Mm.
also brings unique and incredible opportunities and challenges, which I think are creative and exciting. But I could not generate that way of thinking if it was just me sitting talking to myself.
Yeah, I wonder if in the aviation space there's a lot of people who are struggling with that because certainly something that myself and Todd spoke about quite early on was you know are we the only ones thinking this? And it really did feel like that was the case. And obviously we learn more recently we learned a lot more about um polls and statistics. The majority of people are actually concerned about this, and there's no reason to believe that people who work in the aviation space are any different to those numbers. So you know
Yeah.
three quarters, there's a good chance that three quarters of people that we've flown with at some level are actually concerned about this too,
Mm.
because they're not talking about it for all the reasons you mentioned, the overwhelm, the sort of that immobilizing sense of fear, of guilt, of fear, that fear of hypocrisy. That was certainly a big one for me. Like, who am I to speak about this when I do this for a living? What are people going to think? All these different reasons why I then said nothing. And what it felt like, kind of what you were describing almost is like a process for acceptance, because people sometimes say, well, actually acceptance is bad because it's somehow you're giving up. It's just you're just giving in rather than actually seeing acceptance. Like Eckhart Tolle talks about acceptance as like the precursor, like what you can accept, you can move beyond. And it's like I was imagining what you were talking about, one end being like this kind of drama rumination, it's terrible, nothing's ever going to be okay. The other end is repression, where we put it in a box and we pretend it's not there. But actually, what we're saying is it is there. And the majority of people know it's there. They believe in the science. They are concerned. And then the next thing is going, well, not just going there at a technical level, but it's going there at an emotional level. And so, what does that feel like? And it doesn't
Mm.
solve it. But without doing that, we're stuck on it's the way you're describing it almost that really took me back to that what I remembered it was like, where it's like until I can go there, until I can recognize that that is what's going on, it is overwhelming. I don't fully understand it. I certainly don't know what it means for the future of aviation. And that's hard because I love flying and I feel all these different things. And until I can go there and more importantly than internally, as you say, externally, saying it, hearing it from Todd, hearing it from George, and now obviously hearing it from a whole community, it doesn't solve the problem, but you absolutely can't make any steps towards solving anything if you don't do that. And it kind of, I don't know, that's certainly from what you were saying, that's kind of how it related to my experience. Todd, I don't know if that kind of
Yeah.
rings true for you.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. Uh, yeah, I like what you're saying very much, Dan. It's also reminded me to kind of reinforce the point that I think we've made, but let's make it again, that this is not a rational problem, right? And I think one of the things, you're pilots, you are trained technically, rational thinking is really important. Um, and yet, and rationality is, idealized, particularly in Western society. But this is also a non-rational problem because if we were rational creatures, we would not have caused climate change, and we would be taking radical steps to prevent it now, collectively, right? And we're not. So we have this knowledge, and we're not sufficiently speedily taking action on it. So you've got that kind of really strange mix of what does it mean to be human, to be both rational and non-rational at the same time. And so putting that non-rational in there from the unconscious or semi-conscious, or you talked about weirdness earlier on. Yeah. It just gives us a space to think, yeah, this is what it means to be human, and this is what we're creating, and how can we find a way through this?
Mm.
Because we do have creativity and innovative potential, but we need the rational, but we need the non-rational.
Yeah, and I kind of feel that brings us back to your question was, or point you made around sort of the external versus internal, like safe landing is in the future will do a lot to promote, advocate for, support, provide advice around whatever it might be in terms of
Mm,
the active changes that are needed for aviation to be a part of, the future that we all need, and actually the future that is also going to be much better from a job security perspective with it, for people within it as well. And
mm,
yeah, I'm just, I suppose, at a more practical level, Todd, like coming back to like the value of attending these events and where that leads us next in terms of, I don't know, your thoughts in terms of what people might do at a practical level. If someone's come to this event, they've shared, they've heard, they've perhaps unexpectedly, been quite moved. It's not solved anything, but they feel something they didn't feel before, and that's really common. And now what?
yeah.
Yeah, and you spoke about that sense of that we might actually go off the cliff,
Mm,
um, but at the same time, you know, let's at least accept the reality of the world that we live in. And I think from my own experience, one thing I've realized in safe landing is like the chances of us as a small community, like reducing aviation emissions are actually, it's not a task, that we can fix our way out of. But one thing tangibly that we can do as a collective is build resilient community. And I think um, the recent pivot towards the listening circles and the sort of climate fresks that we're offering is in recognition that something that we can achieve and continue conversations like this is just by coming together, hearing one another, building relationships. So if this is the first time you've engaged with Safe Landing, maybe the first time you've attended a listening circle, or you've come through one of the climate fresks, then yeah, there's probably a lot of questions as to if you wanted to get more involved in our community. But really, I would sort of recommend just sort of having a call with us, coming to one of our. We have a monthly online check-in as well, which is the play on the pun of going to check in at the airport terminal, where we're just allowing that space to check in with one another and hear from one another, see how we're getting on, what's the community been up to, and just by hearing some of the work that we're doing, you might think, yeah, actually that's something I could see myself getting involved with, or it could
mm,
just be as simple as you know listening to Caroline just now, or one question I think that's emerging is like if someone sort of were going back to their job, having sort of had this experience, how what's the best way to sort of have that conversation with a colleague that you might
Mm.
think is not engaged or doesn't care, and just the power of creating that space to have that conversation with someone else that in the sector, like that would be an amazing asset for our community to just utilize the networks we already have and those relationships that are already formed.
mm. I often use the image of seed bombing, because people have defenses up because they feel threatened, anxious, it's an uncomfortable subject quite often. Um, so, throw little balls of seeds in clay over the defensive wall, and then step back, and some of them will grow, and some of them won't.
Mm,
But throw things in, but without kind of trying to persuade somebody to see things your way or think the same way as you.
Mm,
It's crucial that these communities embrace diversity of thinking and feeling
Mm.
and imagination. And I loved hearing you earlier, Dan, say you love flying, right? And I think it's really important. I love flying, right? It's an extraordinary, magical thing. And early aviators were some of the most innovative, creative, possibly slightly mad people, who really took humanity in a different direction. And it was only because of that that we were able to see the planet differently. So I do think that groups like Safe Landing can continue that pattern, that innovation, that capacity to help people see things differently, see the planet differently through the extraordinary power of flight, but to think about it differently.
Yeah, I do often wonder, like, what would it be like if the same number of people that are at some level concerned, let's say it is three-quarters of people that work in the sector at the moment, based upon
Mm,
statistics and the population, what if every single one of them at some level was a bit more emotionally aware of what was going on for them, so that it wasn't immobilizing and
mm,
overwhelming and unknown and just this thing that they weren't quite sure what to do with. It was something they were consciously aware of. And perhaps in the process of doing that, there was some pain, but actually some relief in being more aware of that. So you've got a lot of people now who are perhaps feeling better for it because at some level that itch you can't scratch actually isn't very nice. I don't think it's doing a lot of people any good. And then at another level, you've got a whole load of people that are willing to do something. Now, I hope that for the vast, vast majority, that means they stay in the sector in their roles. And that something might be as simple as exactly what you said, the seed bomb. It might just be that every now and again, when the topic comes up, all they
mm,
do is they're willing to say, actually, yeah, I'm quite concerned about it. And I think as a sector, we need to do a lot more. Honestly, I'm not quite sure what that looks like, but I really think we do.
mm, mm,
That's it. Compared to the version of them that would have said nothing and
mm,
had the itch they couldn't scratch that was hurting them a little bit. You've now got
mm,
someone who's more emotionally in tune with what's going on,
mm,
and they're willing to say something right through to perhaps to the people that are really actively involved in pioneering new technologies and leading workers' assemblies and doing all sorts of things.
yeah.
Just imagine a world where that majority of people who are concerned and care are, are more emotionally aware of what's going on and are willing to do something, whatever that is. And I do deeply believe that this process, and certainly hearing you talking, Caroline, kind of helps me to understand more about why, what we want to do here is such an important part of that or piece of that jigsaw.
yeah,
I think
so
to be part of the conversation.
thank you, Caroline. Really, so much gratitude for you coming along and
Pleasure.
sharing your wisdom with us today. And so if you are watching this for the first time and you've not engaged in our community at all yet, then feel free to go on our website. You can sign up to our newsletter there. We have all of our events posted on there as well. And yeah, or if you want a one-to-one chat with one of us in the team, and we'd love to understand what part of the sector you are working in and how we can support you and take it from there really. But yeah, thanks for listening, and we'll hopefully see you at a listening circle or a check-in the near future.
Thanks, Todd, and thanks, Caroline. It's really
No,
enjoyed the
total
conversation.
pleasure, guys.